Tragedy shows what is perishable, what is fragile, and what is slow-moving about us. In a world defined by relentless speed and the unending acceleration of information flows that cultivate amnesia and an endless thirst for the short-term future, allegedly guaranteed through worship of the new prosthetic gods of technology, tragedy is a way of applying the emergency brake. Tragedy slows things down by confronting us with what we do not know about ourselves. An unknown force that unleashes violent effects on us, on a daily, indeed often minute-by-minute basis. Such is the sometimes terrifying presence of the past that we might seek to disavow, but that will have its victory in the end, if only in the form of our mortality. We might think we are through with the past, but the past isn't through with us. Through its sudden reversals of fortune and rageful recognition of the truth of our origins, tragedy permits us to come face to face with what we do not know about ourselves, but what makes those selves the things they are. Tragedy provokes what snags in our being, the snares and booby-traps of the past that we blindly trip over in our relentless, stumbling forward movement. This is what the ancients called fate, and it requires our complicity in order to come down on us. Yet the fruit of a consideration of tragedy is not a sense of life's hopelessness or moral resignation, as Schopenhauer thought, but, I think, a deepened sense of the self in its utter dependency on others. It is a question of the self's vulnerable exposure to apparently familiar and familial patterns of kinship, although it sometimes turns out that, like Oedipus, you don't know who your parents are. But if you do know who your parents are, you still don't know who they are. One of the most salient but enigmatic features of Greek tragedy is its constant negotiation with the other, especially the enemy other, the foreign other, the barbaric other. The oldest extant piece of theatre that we possess, Aeschylus's The Persians from 472 BCE, depicts the defeated enemy not with triumph, but with sympathy, and with an anticipation of the possible humiliation that might face the Athenians should they repeat the hybris of the Persians by invading Greece and desecrating the altars of the enemy's gods. Sadly, the Athenians did not heed Aeschylus's lesson, and the brief period of Athenian imperial hegemony in the central decades of the 5th century BCE ended in the humiliating defeat of the Peloponnesian Wars. There is perhaps a moral to be drawn here for our time and place, where the empire knows its heyday is over and we live in a constant state of war. The first rule of war is sympathy with the enemy. This is something that can be seen in the tragedies of Euripides, especially those that deal with the bloody end of the Trojan War, in plays like The Trojan Women and Hecuba. As Aristotle put it perspicuously, and somewhat blithely, nearly a century after the zenith of Greek drama, in the second half of the 5th century BCE, tragedy is the imitation of action, mimesis praxeos. But what exactly is meant by action? It is far from clear. In play after play of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, what we see are characters who are utterly disoriented by the situation in which they find themselves. They do not know how to act. We find human beings somehow compelled to follow a path of suffering that allows them to raise questions that admit of no easy answer. What will happen to me? How can I choose the right path of action? The overwhelming experience of tragedy is a disorientation expressed in one bewildered and frequently repeated question, what shall I do? Tragedy is not about the metaphysical cultivation of the bios theoretikos, the contemplative life that is the supposed fruit of philosophy in Aristotle's Ethics, or in Epicurus and the other Hellenistic schools. Nor is it about the cultivation of the life of the gods or divine life, hot bios theois, which is also the constant promise of philosophy from Plato onward, as we will see. No, tragedy is thinking in action, thinking upon action, for the sake of action, where the action takes place offstage and is often described to us indirectly through the character of a messenger. But this thinking takes the form of a radical questioning. How do I act? What shall I do? If tragedy is mimesis praxeos, then it is action that is called into question through tragedy, divided and sliced open. What the experience of tragedy invites is neither the blind impulsiveness of action, nor some retreat into a solitary life of contemplation, but the difficulty and uncertainty of action in a world defined by ambiguity, where right always seems to be on both sides. Hegel is right to insist that tragedy is the collision between opposed yet mutually justified claims to what is right. But if both sides are right, then what on earth do we do?